So one of the things I've always been struck by in the academic psychological community is you mentioned that at the bottom of your supposition network, say, is Darwin and not Jung. And I mean, there is a tremendous resistance among academic psychologists to take a look at analytical psychology. And it's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake, especially for people who are interested in narrative. And, it's a hill I've been trying to climb for a very long time, trying to convince people of this, because Jung has a bad name as a mystic, let's say, which is unwarranted accusation given what he was attempting to analyze. If you're interested in story, I mean, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, there's 3 versions of that book. There's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. There's The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann. And there's Psychological Transformations. I hope I've got that right. It's Jung's book. And they're all the same book. They're just written by different people. The Origins and History of Consciousness was written by Erich Neumann, and he was Jung's most outstanding student. Jung wrote the prologue to that and said that was the book that he wished he would have written when he wrote, is it Psychological Transformations? I hope I've got that right. The Hero with a Thousand Faces is a narrative analysis of these superstimuli that you described in Wonderworks. But all of that's taken from this underlying investigation that was conducted by Jung. And it's summarized best in Erich Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And that book isn't widely known among academics, and it's a big mistake. Now, I talked to Camille Paglia about this. And Paglia is more in the field of the literary criticism that you're differentiating yourself from. But she told me, and this was with no prompting from me, that the cultural split that we see now is predicated in part upon literary critics following the guidelines of Foucault and Derrida. Paglia believed that we should have turned to The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann, because he got the story of narrative right. And I believe that that's true. If you're looking for a single book that takes you into this vast corpus of analytical thought about the symbolism of literature, that is by far the most valid entry point. And it's really something for someone like Jung to say, this is the book that I tried my whole life to write but couldn't.
Well, so I will be honest again. I mean, I like Jung a lot. I admire him as a thinker, and I think that he is himself a magician with story. I am, however, not of the view that there is one master story out there in that kind of Jungian way. I mean, and you can feel free, and I know you will, to demolish this. But so let me just start with the Darwinian view of life. I mean, in a Darwinian view of life, to have a Jungian view, you'd have to have this idea that over time there evolved a story, if you're Darwinian, that just worked all the time. And it kind of got embedded in our brain, and we could go back to it over and over again. On the view that I hold, life, because it's unstable and changing, requires us to adapt. And therefore, narrative is flexible. Narrative allows us to adapt. Narrative is another word for plot, is another word for plan. We can be flexible. We can shift. That's not to say that certain stories don't have deep emotional and spiritual power over our brain. Those stories do, but that's one category of stories. I mean, the idea of the book is to say, there's a ton of stuff that stories can do for our brain. Let's go to the stories. Let's see what makes each story different from every other story as opposed to archetypal. I mean, let's go into the particularity. So again, I'm not saying this is the only approach. I'm just saying that my approach is basically the opposite of Jung's. So maybe we're yin and yang.
That's a perfectly reasonable objection in some sense, and I think it's very tightly associated with this discussion that we engaged in a little bit about the particular versus the absolute. And so, your objection is, and it's the Mircea Eliade, great historian of religion, great storyteller. He talked about Deus abscondas. So we have this idea from Nietzsche, let's say, of the death of God. Now, Eliade, and he isn't saying this in reference to Nietzsche, said that one of the problems that religious systems across time faced was Deus abscondus, the disappearing God. And his proposition was, as you move towards a universal absolute, the absolute gets so departicularized that no one knows how to embody it, and it loses all emotional connection. The Catholics solve this problem to some degree with the saints, right? Because they're quasi-deities in some sense and they're very diverse in their behaviors. But this Deus abscondus problem, according to Iliada, has plagued humanity forever. We abstract out these universal ideals, but they become so abstract that they no longer have any grip, right? They lose their narrative grip. And so your objection, and forgive me if I've got this wrong, is that you have to be careful about stressing the absolute to too great a degree because you miss the advantages of the particular. But we could say, I think the way to solve that is to go back to the idea of this nesting of stories, right? Is that you want to rely on the particular because it provides you with specific instructions about how to act here and now. But when it fails, you refer to a level below that that's more abstract to drop a new set of particulars. And so the Jungians are investigating the base, which it would be. Now, see, because I would say an objection to your objection is, no, we have this problem of particularity because we have our individual personalities, and there are particular problems we have to solve. But we have to unify our behavior under some set of abstractions because otherwise we can't exist socially and cooperatively, right, without a standard set of values and mores, and we're disintegrated internally. So we need to solve the problem of particularity and universality simultaneously. And so I wouldn't throw out the universality end of it because it isn't in contradiction to that. The nesting solves that problem.
Well, look, I agree. So first of all, anyone who knows me will tell you that, yes, I am the most rigorously unified person in my own behaviors. And it's possible that part of my own obsession with particularity comes from the fact that I am unified already. And so I'm drawn in a way to find the specific. But I agree with that completely. I mean, I think that there needs to be a balance of the two. It's just that my own career, my own expertise is in the specific. And I have gotten a huge amount of grip in that area because no one has really looked for that before. And a big part of my research is to say, what's actually different, not just about Shakespeare and Homer, but what's different about Hamlet and Lear? What's different about Hamlet and Henry V? What different story mechanisms are in them? If we push those forward, can we actually track different mental effects of those? Yes, we can. And so that's, to your point, that's not at all to abnegate the general, nor to say that the future of humanity lies in some sort of diasporic condition in which we're all just reading single text. But it is to say that, there's clearly more for us to learn. And the danger of generalities and abstractions is always the belief that somehow we know more than we do, because we will say, oh, I've seen that before, or I know that already, And,